Hey everyone, this is the introduction to Marx, Labor Power, Working Class by Mario Tronti. I'm going to read just the table of contents for this piece in general before I start reading the introduction. So, Marx, Labor Power, Working Class. Chapter 1, Hegel and Ricardo. Chapter 2, the exchange of money for labor. Chapter 3, critique of ideology. Chapter 4, woe to June! Chapter 5, the particularity of the commodity labor power. Chapter 6, productive labor. Chapter 7, what the proletariat is. Chapter 8, the forms of struggle. Chapter 9, labor as non-capital. Chapter 10, the labor theory of value as watchword. Chapter 11, the class. Chapter 12, the strategy of refusal. Chapter 13, tactics equals organization. Chapter 14, the struggle against work! Let's start from the fundamental discovery, which according to Marx is at the basis of capital, namely the doppel character of labor represented in commodities. Even in Marx's time, it was obvious that the commodity was something double, at once use value and exchange value. But what had remained unknown to the thought of the time was that the labor expressed in value had different characteristics to those of the labor that produces use values. Near the beginning of Capital, Marx says, quote, "I was the first to point out and to examine critically the twofold nature of the labor contained in commodities," end quote. Parenthesis, Zwiespältige Natur, a nature at once double, divided, and riven, R-I-V-E-N, by contradiction. Indeed, in the 1859 contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, Marx had attempted an analysis of the commodity, quote, as labor presenting a double form, end quote. This was an analysis of use value as real labor or productive activity in accordance with the scope and analysis of exchange value as labor time or equivalent social labor. Here Marx discovered the final critical result of 150 years of classical economy, in England running from William Petty to Ricardo, and in France from Bois-Guilbert to Sismondi. Marx's discovery on this terrain is, quote, the transition from concrete labor to labor which produces exchange value, i.e. the basic form of bourgeois labor, end quote. Already in 1859, Marx's concept of value-producing labor presented the three well-defined facets: simple labor, social labor, and general abstract labor. Each of these facets is in itself a process which immediately presents itself as intimately linked to the processes of the other two. It is precisely the combination of these processes which permits the transition from pre-capitalist forms of labor to capitalist forms of labor, and each process is an objective fact governed by the force of a nascent capitalism's laws of development. Simple labor means the reduction of all labors to a simple, undifferentiated, uniform labor, which is always qualitatively the same and only different in quantitative terms. Complex labor is nothing other than simple labor elevated to the nth power. Labor of greater intensity, of greater specific weight, is always reducible, which is to say must always be reduced to unskilled labor stripped of quality. But labor without quality and, quote, general human labor, end quote, are the same thing, not the labor of different subjects, but different individuals, quote, as mere organs of labor, end quote. Quote, this abstraction, human labor in general, exists in the form of average labor which, in a given society, the average person can perform, productive expenditure of a certain amount of human muscles, nerves, brain, etc. End quote. Marx. The specific form in which labor acquires labor's simple character is therefore that of human labor in general. The reduction to simple labor is a reduction to abstract human labor. The same goes for the social character of value-producing labor. As the analysis of value demonstrates, the conditions of this labor are social determinations of labor, of determinations of social labor. In either case, they are not social tout court. They become so through a particular process. And what is the particularity of this social character? Two things. One, the undifferentiated simplicity of labor, which is to say the equivalent among the labors of different individuals, the social character of the equivalence of the labors of each. Two, the general character of individual labor, which presents itself as its social character, for it is indeed the labor of the individual, but also the labor of an individual undifferentiated from any other. In the logical passage between these two things, which is also the historic passage from the social determinations of labor to the determinations of social labor, the different exchange values find one general equivalent, which is only a social magnitude insofar as it is a general magnitude. But for a product to assume the form of a general equivalent, it is necessary for the labor of the individual itself to assume a general abstract character. The specific form in which labor acquires labor's social character is therefore the form of abstract generalization. The particular trait of this social labor is that it is also abstract human labor. When they produce value, simple labor and social labor are reduced to abstract labor, to labor in general. It is thus mistaken to see in labor the only source of material wealth. For here again, as always, this would mean the concrete labor that creates use values. We must instead speak of abstract labor as the source of exchange values. Concrete labor is realized in the infinite variety of concrete labor's use values. Abstract labor is realized in the equivalence among commodities as general equivalents. That labor, which creates use values, is the natural condition of human life, the condition of the organic change between man and nature. Conversely, that labor which creates exchange values is a specifically social form of labor. The first is particular labor that splits up into infinite types of labor. The second is always general, abstract, and equivalent labor. Quote, labor as a source of material wealth was well known both to Moses, the lawgiver, and to Adam Smith, the customs official. End quote. Marx. Value-creating labor is the first fundamental discovery of the working class point of view of application to capitalist society. With the publication of the first volume of Capital, sorry, one second. With the publication of the first volume of Capital, Marx wrote to Engels, quote, the best points in my book are 1. This is fundamental to all understanding of the facts. The twofold character of labor. According to whether labor is expressed in use value or exchange value, which is brought out in the very first chapter. 2. The treatment of surplus value regardless of surplus value's particular forms. Surplus value regardless of surplus value's particular forms as profit, interest, ground rent, etc. End quote. A few months later, in another letter, Marx criticized Derling's review of Capital for having failed to grasp the, quote, fundamentally new elements, end quote, of the book, namely, quote, 1, that in contrast to all former political economy, which from the very outset, treats the different fragments of surplus value with the different fragments of surplus value's fixed forms of rent, profit, and interest is already given, I first deal with the general form of surplus value, in which all these fragments are still undifferentiated, in solution, as it were. 2, that the economists, without exception, have missed the simple point that if the commodity has a double character, use value and exchange value, then the labor represented by the commodity must also have a twofold character. While the mere analysis of labor as such, as in Smith, Ricardo, etc., is bound to come up everywhere against inexplicable problems, end quote. We will later return to the organic connection that intimately links the content of these two discoveries, the concept of labor power and the concept of surplus value. For the moment, we will push on in tracking down the origin of this first concept in the work of Marx and in Marx's sources. Quote, if then we disregard the use value of commodities, only one property remains, that of being products of labor, end quote. Marx. But even the product of labor can have a use value. We can look beyond this and erase all commodities' tangible qualities. This latter will then no longer even be the product of a determinate productive labor. Quote, the useful character of the kinds of labor embodied in them also disappears. This in turn entails the disappearance of the different concrete forms of labor. They can no longer be distinguished but are altogether reduced to the same kind of labor, human labor in the abstract, end quote. Marx. What then remains of the products of labor at this point? Nothing if not, quote, the same phantom-like objectivity. They are merely congealed quantities of homogeneous human labor, end quote. There is only, quote, human labor power expended without regard to the form of its expenditure, end quote. Only as crystals of this common substance, human labor power, are things, quote, values, commodity values, end quote. A common social substance, parenthesis, gemeinschaftliche, gesellschaftliche Substanz, of things, common among commodities, which is to say common among the products of labor, and not, quote, the common social substance of exchange value, end quote. See the beginning of the, quote, critical notes on Adolf Wagner's treatise on political economy, quote. But wertblendende Substanz, valorizing substance. This is the first definition of the concept of labor power that we find in Marx's Capital. Here Marx says Arbeitskraft, whereas in theories of surplus value, Marx instead used the term Arbeitsvermögen, and in the Grundrisse he had mostly used Arbeitsvermögen, had used Arbeitsfähigkeit. The concept is the same. Here we are not interested in the philological shift from one term to another. In Marx, the distinction between labor and labor power is found in the already complete form in all the works preparing his contribution to the critique of political economy. See the Grundrisse for the years 1857 to 58. If we consider that these works span a decade, from 1849 to 1859, we would properly locate just after 1848 Marx's definitive discovery of the concept of labor power in all its significance, and naturally enough, we can also find seeds of this discovery in all the works before this date. Through these works, we can document a development internal to the concept of labor power itself, that is to say, its gradual internal specification, giving it ever greater scientific qualifications, up till the decisive encounter and its definitive identification with the concept of the working class amidst the revolutionary experience of 1848. Already in some of Marx's notebooks of excerpts from the works of the great economists, which he compiled in Paris in 1844, which thus prepared or contemporary to the 1844 manuscripts, we can find the concept, the term Erwerbsarbeit. We think this can be translated directly as, quote, industrial labor, end quote. Marx tells us that in industrial labor we have, quote, 1, estrangement and fortuitous connection between labor and the subject who labors. 2, estrangement and fortuitous connection between labor and the object of labor. 3, the worker's role is determined by social needs, which, however, are alien to him, and a compulsion to which he submits out of egoistic need and necessity, and which have for him only the significance of a means of satisfying his dire need, just as for them he exists only as a slave of their needs. 4, that to the worker the maintenance of his individual existence appears to be the purpose of the worker's activity, and what the worker actually does is regarded by the worker only as a means which the worker carries on, that the worker carries on his life's activity in order to earn means of subsistence, end quote. Marx. Given these foundations, the unity of human labor is considered only in terms of the division of labor. Once we have presupposed the division of labor, then for the individual the product, the material of private property, increasingly assumes significance as an equivalent, and the equivalent acquires its existence as an equivalent through money. The total domination of the estranged object over man, manifests itself already in money. Quote, the separation of work from itself. Bracket, Trennung der Arbeit von sich selbst, end bracket. Separation of the worker from the capitalist, separation of labor from capital, end quote. The economists distinguish between production, consumption, and as the intermediary between the two, exchange or distribution. But the, quote, separation of production and consumption, of action and spirit in different individuals and in the same individual, is the separation of labor from labor's object, from labor's self as something spiritual, end quote. Marx. It is the separation of, quote, labor from labor, end quote, parenthesis, Trennung der Arbeit von Arbeit, in parenthesis. In the first of the 1844 manuscripts, in the section on the wage, Marx writes, quote, it goes without saying that the proletarian, bracket, proletarier, or proletarier, I'm not sure how to say that, bracket, proletarier, and bracket, i.e. the man who, being without capital and rent, lives purely by labor and by a one-sided abstract labor, bracket, rein von der Arbeit und einer einseitigen abstrakten Arbeit lebt, end bracket. It is considered by political economy only as a worker, bracket, Arbeiter, end bracket, ... In political economy, labor occurs only in the form of activity as a source of livelihood, bracket, unter der Gestalt der Erwerbstätigkeit, end bracket, end quote. But if we, quote, rise above the level of political economy, end quote, two decisive questions arise, which for good reason occur to Marx precisely at this point. Quote, 1. What in the evolution of mankind is the meaning of this reduction of the greater part of mankind to abstract labor. Bracket, auf die abstrakte Arbeit, end bracket. 2. What are the mistakes committed by the piecemeal reformers who either want to raise wages and in this way to improve the situation of the working class, or regard equality of wages, parenthesis, as Proudhon does, in parenthesis, as the goal of social revolution, end quote. Marx. Only much later in Capital would Marx give a likewise decisive and wholly accurate response to this question, given their strongly, quote, ideological form. In the manuscripts, it is difficult to find practically anything more than the indication of direction for future research, which is doubtless already present. Quote, true, it is a result of the movement of private property. The movement of private property that we have obtained the concept of alienated labor, of alienated alienated life, and parenthesis, in political economy. But on analysis of this concept, it becomes clear that though private property appears to be the reason, the cause of alienated labor, it is rather its consequence, just as the gods are originally not the cause but the effect of man's intellectual confusion. Later this relationship becomes reciprocal. Only at the culmination of the development of private property does this, its secret, appear again, namely that on the one hand it is the product of alienated labor, and that on the other it is the means by which labor alienates itself, the realization of this alienation, end quote. Marx. The reversal of the relation between labor and capital is already here, in the form of a seed. Already here we can grasp all the possibilities that it offers of a revolutionary methodological approach, which throws open the door to immediately subversive solutions, simultaneously both at the level of theoretical research and the level of practical struggle. We will show that this is the red thread running through all of Marx's work. Yet at this point we can observe that in this present work this discovery has not gone further than a brilliant intuition, still subject to the uncertainties of an objective path through the history of capital. And the path it is taking is slower and more complex, more indirect and unsure than the one that Marx's working class point of view was able to consider. This strategic reversal of the relationship between labor and capital today needs to be wholly rediscovered. It needs to be expounded anew and in full as a method of analysis and a guide to action. Even a minimal tactical grasp of the present situation makes the truth of this principle visible to the naked eye. The culmination point of capital's development, in fact, again reveals its secret, and emphatically so. Quote, the subjective essence of private property as activity for private property's self, as subject, as person, is labor, end quote. Marx. It was political economy that first acknowledged labor as political economy's principle. Quote, it thus revealed itself to be a product of private property in modern industry. Those who fetishized the mercantilist monetary system only knew of an objective essence of wealth. The physiocratic doctrine represented a decisive phase in the discovery of a subjective existence of wealth in labor, but this was more a question of a concrete particular labor linked to a determinate natural element serving as its material. Starting with Adam Smith, political economy recognized the general essence of wealth, and that was then led to, quote, the raising up of labor in its total absoluteness. i.e. its abstraction as the principle, end quote. Quote, it is argued against physiocracy that agriculture, from the economic point of view, that is to say, from the only valid point of view, does not differ from any other industry, and that the essence of wealth, therefore, is not a specific form of labor bound to a particular element, a particular expression of labor, but labor in general. Bracket, Arbeit überhaupt, end bracket, end quote. In the process of scientific understanding of the subjective essence of private property, labor initially appeared only as agricultural labor, and then made itself recognized as general labor. I'm not sure, but I think like the French physiocrats had this idea that the only actual productive labor was labor in agriculture. I'm not an expert on the physiocrats or what's his name, Francois Quesnay, but I believe that was their position. At this point, quote, all wealth has become industrial wealth. The wealth of labor and industry is accomplished labor, just as the factory system is the perfected essence of industry that is of labor, and just as industrial capital is the accomplished objective form of private property, end quote. Marx. In the Arbeitslohn manuscript, dated Brussels, December 1847, we read right at the beginning, quote, Die menschliche Tätigkeit equal Ware, end quote. Human activity equals commodity. Further on we read, quote, the worker, bracket, der Arbeiter, bracket, quote, the worker, der Arbeiter, the laborer, not labor, becomes an increasingly one-sided productive force, bracket, productive Kraft, bracket, which produces as much as possible in as little time as possible. Skilled labor increasingly transformed into simple labor, end quote. Marx. So here already we have the general human activity of the worker reduced to a commodity, the most complex labor reduced to the simplest. At the end of the manuscript, we moreover find a paragraph put in parentheses by Marx, indicating that Marx wants to consider the problem, quote, in general form, end quote. Quote, since Marx has become a commodity and as such subject to free competition, one seeks to produce it as cheaply as possible, i.e., at the lowest possible production cost. All physical labor has thereby become infinitely easy and simple for the future organization of society, end quote. Marx. Thus already here we have the theme of social labor, even if its particular content remains in doubt, not yet having been well defined. The manuscript, titled Wages, provides a trace of the lectures that Marx gave to the German Workers' Association in Brussels in 1847. This manuscript develops some points which he would not take up any further even in the famous Neue Rheinische Zeitung articles on wage, labor, and capital from April 1849. If we treat the 1847 manuscript in the same way that Engels did these 1849 articles, that is, substituting the word Arbeitskraft for Arbeit every time that we are dealing with abstract labor, which is to say everywhere, this is a notable practical result. That is to say, the concept of labor power and the word itself appears in the works of Marx, not only before Capital, but also before the Manifesto, and as a specific discovery of this dating back, as we see it, to that first and still insufficient critique of political economy that appeared in the 1844 manuscripts. The worker, quote, does not sell labor, but puts his labor at the disposal of the capitalist for a definite time, In return for a definite payment, he hires out or sells his labor power, but this labor power is intergrown with his person and is inseparable from it. Its cost of production, therefore, coincides with his cost of production, what the economists called the cost of production of labor is really the cost of production of the worker and therewith of his labor power, end quote, says Engels in the 1891 Introduction to Wage, Labor, and Capital. Here lies the whole difference between labor and labor power. In the concept of labor power, there is the figure of the worker, whereas this is not true of the concept of labor. And the figure of the worker, who is selling her own, quote, labor, sells herself as, quote, labor power, end quote, appears in her entirety in the works of Marx, right from his youthful analyses of alienated labor. This is, indeed, the precondition for his whole discourse. In the conditions imposed by capital, the alienation of labor and the alienation of the worker are one and the same thing. Otherwise, we would have to conclude that this analysis does not concern capitalist society, but society in general, not the worker, but in general. Such is the error of those who try to find in the young Marx nothing more than old philosophy of totality. But the limit of Marx's pre-1848 works instead lies elsewhere. It lies in the still insufficient definition of labor power as a commodity, or rather, in the absence of an analysis of the particular characteristics of this commodity, and of the consideration of labor power as a, quote, entirely special, end quote, commodity. Already in the Marx before 1848, we find abstract labor as labor power, and then labor power as commodity. But it was only the revolutionary turning point of 1848 that exposed within Marx's own head the theoretical process that would lead Marx to discover the particular content of the commodity labor power. This commodity was linked no longer through the alienation of labor to the historical figure of the worker, but to the birth of capital itself through the production of surplus value. Near the beginning of Wage, Labor, and Capital, we find this enlightening statement, quote, "Now, after our readers have seen the class struggle develop in colossal political forms in 1848, the time has come to deal more closely with the economic relations themselves, on which the existence of the bourgeoisie and the bourgeoisie's class rule, as well as the slavery of the workers, are founded," end quote. We can say that only in 1848, or rather June 1848, did the concept of labor power first encounter the movements of the working class in Marx's thought, thus giving rise to the truly Marxian history of the commodity labor power. This latter reappeared better defined in the contribution to the critique of political economy and later in Capital, now endowed with all its, quote, special characteristics, end quote, that is, with all its specifically working class content. In this sense, even though it had beaten the workers on the battlefield, the bourgeoisie of the time was right to lament, quote, "woe to June," exclamation point, end quote. Labor as abstract labor, and thus as labor power, is present already in Hegel. Labor power, and not only labor as a commodity, is present already in Ricardo. As for commodity labor power as working class, this is Marx's discovery. The double character of labor is only the premise to this. It does not constitute the discovery, but only the means of enriching it. We arrive at the working class not from labor, but from labor power. To speak no longer of labor, but of labor power, is to speak of the worker and no longer of labor. The terms labor power, living labor, and living worker are synonymous. The critique of the expression, quote, "the value of labor," end quote, and the definition of the, quote, "value of labor power," end quote, allows an avenue to the concept of surplus value. Pre-Marxist and indeed post-Marxian socialist ideology never completed this path and thus never brought out the historical existence of the working class. And what indeed is this latter at this level, if not the social labor power that produces surplus value? From surplus value to profit, and from profit to capital, that is the path that it follows. the living commodity which is the socially organized worker, thus proves to be not only the theoretical origin, but also the historical practical precondition that we can call the fundamental articulation of capitalist society. Glied and Grund at the same time. But these are the conclusions of our discourse. We still need to demonstrate the premises. The search for the main sources of the concept of labor in Marx does not arise out of any scholastic need to philologically specify the terms of the problem. Rather, it stems from the practical need to identify Marx's true discoveries, to be able to recognize and develop Marx's true discoveries, as well as the tendentious choice to separate out from the outset everything that painfully comes to life on the terrain of working class thought, precisely in order to use, for our own ends, parts of the adversary's thought. What Schumpeter called, quote, the impressive synthesis that is Marx's work, end quote, almost always has the following characteristic. It is not his own individual discovery that counts, but rather his integrated use of discoveries by others, by their collective reorganization by reference to a single direction of thought, with the specific and unilateral orientation provided by this single point of view. The sectarianism of working class science is all here. Marx provided a model which Marx himself was not always capable of following in his analyses and conclusions. No Marxist after him did. The only decisive exception was Lenin and Lenin's revolution. In this case, the method of unilateral synthesis, the approach to comprehensively grasping a given social reality, started from the deliberate choice of a tendency, had a practical result in concrete forms of political organization. This is the most important phase in the history of working class thought since Marx. From that point, the bourgeois mystification of an immediate identification between the particular interests of a class and the general interests of society proved no longer tenable at either a theoretical or practical level. Control over society in general is to be attained by struggle, imposing the explicit domination of a specific class. On this terrain, two viewpoints of near equal force and power collide. The universal reign of ideology crumbles. There is now only room for two antithetical class positions, each looking to impose, through dexterity and violence, its exclusive domination over society. Lenin imposed this on the capitalists of his time and practice by organizing the revolution prematurely. Marx's own analysis of capitalist society was also, quote, premature with respect to its era. That is why Marx's Capital and the October Revolution had the same historical destiny. It is easy to list the enormous historical and logical contradictions that made both of them, quote, impossible, but ultimately the conclusion to be drawn is that all this does not even slightly put into doubt their validity. The truth is that each involved one same method applied at two different levels. That is, the theoretical and practical use of a web of material conditions, a series of concepts and circumstances, from a rigorously working class point of view, in a process aimed at the subversion of capitalist society. Marx's treatment of the categories of political economy and the concepts of classical philosophy is the same treatment that Lenin reserved for the intermediate layers of the old society and the historic parties of the old Russian state. Marx powerfully discovered a tactical moment of research, the practical capacity to use certain results obtained by the science of the time, inverting them in the opposed dimension of a strategic alternative. Lenin, the only Marxist to have understood Marx on this point, directly translated this theoretical approach into laws for action. Laws for action. The Leninist discovery of tactics is only the extension, in the practical domain, of a theoretical discovery of Marx's, namely the conscious, realistic, and never ideological unilateralism of the working class point of view on capitalist society. Our ambition is to demonstrate that, quote, all the value in labor, end quote, and, quote, all power to the Soviets, end quote, are one and the same thing. They are two watchwords that encompass a tactical moment of struggle, yet do not contradict any of its possible strategic developments. All the value in labor and all power to the Soviets are two laws of movement, not those of capitalist society. This may have been an error of Marx's, since here we risk losing the tactical moment, but those of the working class within capitalist society, and this is the Leninist correction of Marx. For clarity's sake, a reference to Marx's sources regarding the specific and decisive question of the definition of the concept of labor is here essential. The Marx-Hegel relationship has long been studied, but almost nothing has been done on Marx's relationship to Ricardo. Most interesting would be to study the Hegel-Ricardo relation. If we had the time and the political calm to do so, we might consider mounting a detailed comparative analysis of Hegel's phenomenology and Ricardo's principles. We would find that the material dealt with is identical, as is the way of treating it, their method. The difference lies only in the quote form with which it is treated, which oriented Hegel and Ricardo towards different disciplines, unable to communicate with one another. Here we shall limit ourselves to bringing out the Hegel-Ricardo relation in its objective terms by means of a separate although parallel analysis. As Marx put it, quote, if the Englishman transforms men into hats, the German transforms hats into ideas. The Englishman is Ricardo, a rich banker and distinguished economist. The German is Hegel, an ordinary professor of philosophy at the University of Berlin, end quote. Marx. And that is the end of the introduction to Marx, Labor Power, Working Class by Mario Tronti. Thank you so much for listening.